In this video, I'm going to share some tips and tricks to help you get the most out of priming with your airbrush. Airbrushes are very useful miniature painting tools, but I do understand that they have a learning curve and can be a bit daunting, especially if you've never used one before. So I've compiled this list of advices that I would give to beginner painters, and maybe one or two of them will be useful for the vets out there as well. Tip number 1, safety. I'm not a safety expert, and I really don't want to throw out false information, so I'm going to keep this one practical to my experience. The one thing I can always recommend wearing is some kind of latex or nitrile or other kind of glove. I say glove because you don't really need one for the hand you're spraying with, but the hand that holds the model is almost always likely to get some overspray on it. The pigments won't hurt your skin, as you see us streamers and YouTubers painting on our thumbs all the time, but if you're doing lots of models, it will build up, so best to take the hassle out of it and just wear a glove. As far as needing a mask or spray booth, that's going to be up to your personal safety standard. If you feel you need a mask, a good fitting N95 mask should protect against most backspray. Speaking of backspray, unless you have a ventilated spray booth, I'd actually stay away from having a backing to spray against. Airbrushes push the paint away from you naturally, and having a backing only reflects that spray backwards towards your face. Use a covering to shield things you don't want spray on instead, so you don't get pigments blowing back into you. Tip number 2, what color to prime? The benefit of starting your model with an airbrush is that you can overcoat it with pretty much any color you want without needing to buy a new can of spray. That said, primer paints are formulated with primer additives, making them more sticky to plastic models. Some paint lines have those formulated in the paint already. Chimera Color Black is one I just recently learned that has something like that in it. Most paint-on primers come in black, gray, and white, though you can now find warm and cool off-white as well. If you are going to overcoat a model a color, like say Space Marines who are mostly a single color, choose your first primer layer based on how bright you want that first color layer to be. A black for something you want to start out darker, and a gray or white for something much more vibrant. Tip number 3, thinning the primer. Airbrushes are happiest when paints are thin, too thick, and they have trouble aerosolizing. To be clear in the definition here, when I say thin, I mean in relation to viscosity. Paint comes out of the tube or bottle quite viscous, and so we want to add a thinning medium or water to reduce that until it flows like water. But we don't want to dilute the pigment density more than we have to for priming either. For this, I like to use the sides of the well to test the viscosity. If it sticks up along the sides of the well too thickly, add in another drop of thinner or water. If it's not sticking at all, then add a bit more paint, as it's probably become too diluted. Tip number 4, prime the model to be primed. This seems like a counterintuitive one. Why would you need to prime a model that you're about to prime? But this step actually helps get a more even final layer by giving the heavier coat of paint something to stick to without beating up. From about 8 to 10 inches away from the model, you want to spray a dusting of paint over it. This will partially dry on the way to the model and stick to it in a fine dust-like coat. If it's more sandy than dusty, you'll probably want to thin the paint a bit more. You don't need to be heavy with it either. Just a nice shower of particles is what we're looking for. Don't worry about getting it in the crevices either. This is to the benefit of the flatter parts of the model more than anything. Here's an example of the difference of how a thinned primer will act over a particularly slick model versus one we've dusted. Less beading means a more even coat. Tip number 5, have an old, cheap, or ratty brush nearby. Airbrushes, as the name implies, blow air across a needle which siphons paint over it to aerosolize and spray outwards. Which makes it a bit strange that that's also how we get paint to dry faster, by blowing over it. What that means practically is that your paint is going to dry on the needle tip regardless of how much it's been thinned. So to keep the paint flowing, I like to dampen an old brush nearby to clean the tip, and then rinse off. Just like we shouldn't leave dry paint on a paintbrush after using it for a bit, Same goes for an airbrush. If you find yourself having to give it more air and pulling back the needle more, that's when the needle needs a good wipe. If it doesn't work though, we can percolate. Tip number 6, percolation. Percolation is the process of reversing the airflow by obstructing the spray opening, usually with a finger or a paper towel, to clear the paint chamber of obstruction. This pushes anything in the chamber backwards back into the paint well. It is safe to do as long as you don't have the well's lid on and your compressor has a moisture trap. When you percolate, start the airflow before pulling the needle back. Otherwise, this should help clear the smaller chamber where the needle is of smaller obstructions, though over time they will get back in there and you will have to clean it out. But it will let you use more of the paint in the well before having to. Us lazy painters also do this to mix paint in the well, as well as during cleaning to have the water or cleaner rush back and forth through the chamber. Tip number 7, satin versus matte. How you decide you'll be painting the overall model will depend on if you want to go with a satin primer or a matte one. A satin primer is good for washes, as it acts like a glass surface where the paint will want to beat up. Using this to your advantage, you can make washes pool in recesses and run away from plateaus. It will, however, make it hard for a thin paint to base coat over evenly, as it may break up into beads. A matte primer goes on more like a velvet and will hold paint exactly where you put it, making it better for getting even base coats and even washes. If you plan on doing a color overcoat over the primer layer, then a matte will give a much more even layer for that overcoat. Quick tip number 8. And one more quick tip, mostly for the 3D printers who print and prime with gray. If you're not sure if you missed any spots on your model because they're too close in color, and you have one of these UV flashlights, just give it a shine on your model, and anything you missed will become painfully obvious. So hopefully these tips help you get the most out of your airbrush, at least when it comes to priming your models. And I do have a couple more tips in relation to priming that should help your painting go a little bit further. Advanced technique number 1, Zenithal priming. I've covered this in a few other videos, but essentially Zenithal priming is the practice of using white or gray on black to create contrast in your model. By angling the airbrush, you can create spray patterns that simulate directional light. Some painters will use this just as a guide for where their highlights and shadows need to go, painting over it completely in the end, while others will use it for glazing other colors over top, retaining the contrast underneath. It doesn't have to be strictly black and white either. You can use colors to create interesting contrasts between hues. Zenithal isn't necessary for priming or painting a model, but it is something to consider trying to see if it helps you in your journey. Advanced technique number 2, color or mood sketches. Because airbrushes are a single point that's spread out, they're very good at simulating point lights. In video, a point light is a light that emanates outward from a single point, like in this example. So we can create a mood by adding different colored lights around a model. Similarly, we can do the same with an airbrush, overcoating parts of the model by picking out our light sources. So from underneath, we might have a red glow. In the shadows, they're dark and cool, while overhead a lamp lights up their face and shoulders. While none of this may be seen in the final model, it gives you a sense of the mood and lighting your model is in. So as you paint it, you can accurately place those highlights and colors towards the source of light you want them to be coming from. I'd like to end by saying that these tips and tricks are only things I found to work for myself. They are in no way rules or universally agreed upon by everyone. I'm just trying to help get others started on the right track. But if you find other ways that work better for you, that's totally okay too. If you have your own tips you'd like to share, feel free to leave them in the comments. And please subscribe if you'd like to see more fun videos about miniature painting. And until next time, good luck on your own painting journey.